Hey, this is David Rovix, everybody out there, with another episode of Discussions with David. In one form or another, I'm live streaming interviews with people of note every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. On Tuesdays, it's Fifth Estate Live, produced by Peter Werby of the Fifth Estate Magazine Editorial Collective. And then on Wednesdays and Fridays, I do basically the same thing, except it's produced by me, Discussions with David, and it's all broadcast on the same platforms, including right now where you may be watching on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance or the Facebook page of KBOO Community Radio or one of my own platforms, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, VK, LinkedIn, and something else I've forgotten. And it all goes in podcast form afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. And today we are spending the hour with an amazing science fiction author and poet from upstate New York these days named Jon Frankel, and who I got turned on to by another author that I interviewed a couple months ago for Fifth Estate Live. And with no further ado, I will just bring Jon onto the screen. Lovely to have you on the show, such as it is. Jon, you've first of all you've just put out a fantastic book, part of a series, and it's also during a pandemic, which whole lot of questions. Just in that sentence, I want to unpack each one of those words and ask you about that. But how's it been trying to publish a book during the pandemic?
Well, thank you for having me on your broadcast.
Oh yeah,
I'm really grateful. Well, it's never
that tells us something right there. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, getting any kind of publicity is, of course, difficult under any circumstances, and particularly with the pandemic, not being able to give live readings is just it's a huge impediment. I think I was reading one of your other pieces. Like musicians, authors really depend upon giving readings at this point because there's very little other publicity. But people will show up to hear you read. So that's been a problem. And I know locally another author did a drive-in theater reading.
But so painful, but yeah, of course, right?
Exactly. But with my crew of 25 local readers, I thought that wouldn't work out so well. So I'm doing my best, and my publisher is. We're trying to get reviews.
What was it like? Can we stick with the subject of publishing and write? I mean, to me as an artist, this is hopefully other people out there find it interesting. I mean, I want to talk about your writing too, but a lot. But the fact of just trying to get a book published these days. I mean, I've been reading a wonderful book called The Death of the Artist recently about the sort of campaign of various corporations to destroy the arts in every possible way since the internet came along. But what's been before the pandemic? You would actually do speaking tours and get that would be a helpful way to get a book out there.
To an extent, yes. I mean, all of it is challenging. So the internet is really at the heart of it. So the internet both enables and marginalizes. So sure, I have ebooks and I have gone and read in different cities, although I've read to empty rooms. I think a lot of authors have that experience where the people in the car are your audience. But I've also read to audiences where I don't know anybody, which has been really cool. And read in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Missoula, Montana, Portland, Maine. So it is possible with very little money to put a tour together. But the marginalization comes in where you get no traction from that. So, artists, I think, are faced with this choice of having an audience but no income, or making a play for commercial publishing, which is as difficult as getting your screenplay produced and released as a Hollywood film. I mean, it's preposterous, and I think we're all facing that.
And has that become? I mean, I know you are even a little bit older than me, I think, but you've been at this since well before the internet became a thing, and so you've people of our age or older are sort of in a particular situation where we may actually have had, like I think in both of our cases, extensive experience with being independent artists prior to the internet. And I want, can you talk about, especially for anybody who's like younger than the age of 40, what, how has the internet and specifically Amazon impacted your life as an author?
Well, okay, so I wrote my first books on a typewriters. I mean, I actually typed books, and
I used to type. I used to. Sorry, I used to transcribe authors' typed books. I used to do that for a living as a teenager. Just it used to be a profession.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember when the art department had 25 people in it now, and now it's like one guy on a laptop at home. And now he's at home. 8 months ago, he came into the office, or she came in the office, and now they're at home. And Amazon has been a mixed blessing. I can sell books through Amazon, and even more easily than my local bookstore. It's just getting them to order. So the way this has affected the publishing business is my first publisher was a bricks and mortar small press. Her whole philosophy was keeping all of her books in print. She was manic depressed. She's still there. She's in San Francisco. And that was fairly straightforward. The bookstores would buy the book and sell it. But now, when I started with Whiskey Tit, we published ebooks and print on demand, and no bookstores would carry a print on demand title unless you gave it to them on concession. Essentially, you would give them, you would give them the book, and they would only pay you for it if they sold it. I'm sorry, I have background noise here.
No problem. We're used to that these days.
Yeah, it's like so. So Amazon has meant that my books are distributable nationally, but it also ghettoizes you. I mean, I don't know what other word to use. You get trapped in this, and it's just like self-publishing. Well, it used to be shameful. You just didn't publish yourself. Now it's quite normal, but I think the taint of self-publication still clings to it, even though an example from film is anybody can can do a digital film for very little money now, and there have been some really good ones, like the Florida Project. This guy who, his first film was a cell phone film. So, these things are all they are all equivocal. They're both good and bad. Unfortunately, Amazon is the one who makes all of the money. Like a musician, you can sell all the 99-cent songs you want, and Spotify and Apple are going to get all the money.
Yeah, so, and to update folks on that, nobody's downloading. Nobody pays for downloads anymore. It's all streaming, and iTunes has had to adapt to Spotify's extremely low pay model and do the same thing. So it's like this race to the bottom. But what I've been reading about is how Amazon has been engaged in exactly the same kinds of sort of predatory practices. Like, I mean, with Amazon's pay scale, you'd have to be like with Spotify. You'd have to be a million selling author to really actually make a living from the, like, what is it, Kindle Unlimited or something these days? Like, people all are supposed to have their books streamed. Like, it used to be you'd sell books, and I guess you still can, but they're encouraging people to sign up for this streaming thing, and then you get paid even less. And whether you get exposure or of course you can die of exposure, as they say, but yeah, whether you get exposure is totally a matter of question. I mean, so many of those books have never been read, and those songs have never been streamed that are up there.
Yeah, and that's where local communities come in. So, and that also changes. What are your expectations as an artist? We have these commercial expectations have formed, and with the novel, you could say probably from some point in the 18th century through the 20th, they were evolving and more or less working, but authors were still running around trying to figure out how to make a living then. If you could get a play into production, you'd make more money. And that's even in the 19th century. But I don't think I know I didn't become an artist to make money. I tried to make money so I could remain as an artist. And that has been the central difficulty in my life. And this brings up, what was it like 40 years ago? Well, there was a reasonable expectation for me 40 years ago that I could have a part-time day job and afford rent in Manhattan, and spend half of my day writing and hanging out with my artist friends, and half my day slinging hash in a restaurant where I could make, at the time, $15 an hour, which was, sort of $12 over minimum wage. So, that was a really viable lifestyle. The fact that I was 22 and didn't realize it was not necessarily a long-term viable lifestyle is a different issue. But it was economically feasible for an artist to support themselves and as long as they're willing to be somewhat poor, relatively so, you could get by and be in a major city like New York City or San Francisco, and that's impossible now.
And the main reason that's impossible, I mean, there's multiple reasons why that's impossible, right? But one of the main ones is I guess the housing crisis. But then another one, I don't know, maybe close behind that would be the lack of possible ways to actually produce income from being an artist these days, right? I mean, maybe the exposure is one thing, but the actual any income is going to now what are the 5 biggest corporations in the world, which are a bunch of tech companies.
Yeah, and then and then a few media companies own all of the music companies. Media companies own all of the publishing, and I mean, this is also a very long-term trend. It goes back to the late 60s and 70s, but it is, the internet is like rocket fuel. Everything they've planned, they can now do. So incomes have collapsed. Rents have skyrocketed. Cities are for rich people, unless they are the so-called loser cities, the shithole cities, in which case you could move there. And frankly, when I lived on the Lower East Side in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a shithole city. There's no way around it. We loved it dearly. Most people would not tolerate what day-to-day life was there, and yet there are many cities in America where it is still day-to-day life, where you don't know what's going to happen when you walk out your door. Or perhaps you do know and you're afraid of that. I just think, for me, the time that it takes to create art is really important, and the freedom that you need to do that is really important. And probably I published my first book in 1993, but I wrote it in the late 80s. After 1991, I had a 40-hour-a-week job, 2 children, and a day late and a dollar short was my life for 20 years. And it took 5 years to write a pulp novel, which is ridiculous. Someone like Philip K. Dick, whipped them out in 6 weeks.
But when you're working full time and raising 2 kids, so that doesn't leave any time for writing, does it?
No,
and then the best time of your day when you're, I always heard about these wonderful stories about Beethoven and stuff, writing all this stuff at 4 a.m. before, but the reality, at least for me and many other people, is if you are working even a part-time job, there goes your best creative energy of the day, and then the rest of the day is kind of downhill. I don't know, maybe I've never been one of those people that sort of comes alive and starts writing late at night. I'm a morning person, so if I'm working, then that shoots everything to hell. But I don't know.
Well, morning, obviously, yes, morning the mind is active. I found, after dinner with some inducements, I can squeeze an hour and a half of workout,
right.
But it's not satisfactory. I always compared that, writing a novel that way, to building a mountain with a teaspoon. So, if it takes you, if you could write 2 pages in an hour and a half, which would be a pretty good pace, a person's going to read that in 2 minutes, So your chapter may be 10 or 15 pages. Maybe you're going to spend a week on that. But without having the time to actually read that entire chapter as a whole and revise it as a whole, it's very difficult to get into the time that the reader is going to get into, the flow. It's like we're in animation, where you can lavish days and hours on an action that's going to literally be a second or 2 in the film, and then you got to do the next second or 2. But at some point, you got to run the whole thing through to make sure it's working. And so I did that, and I think, as awful as it was good training. I had to really learn my craft and get a lot of discipline, which I think is difficult for younger artists. that's part of what your process as an artist aging is to learn the discipline and the craft and the ability to really stick with something and have some insight and perspective on it. So, I will say the internet makes distribution a lot easier. Right? You're not using carbon paper and whiteout and page 13, page 13A, page 13B with crossouts, circles, and arrows. You kind of can revise forever and then send off your electronic file, and then your publisher doesn't necessarily have to have 10,000 copies of the book sitting in a warehouse somewhere and not able to write off the taxes. So there are things that have improved for a marginal artist like me.
There are pros and cons. It's not all just a negative influence.
It's hard not to see everything as being just really negative at the moment. I'm not trying to look on the bright side here, but I don't know. I think in some ways the horror is the loss of the mid-list artist. I'm sure in the 70s, just finding a publisher somewhere to publish and distribute your books who wasn't going to ask, why aren't I making my money now? That's a huge loss. It's just incalculable. But whatever. We got to keep moving.
Yeah, it is what it is, as somebody said.
As our great leader said.
Jon, when you are, it just seems like there's the way that the pandemic has gone. As a big fan of dystopic fiction, apparently that's not even technically, I don't know. That's a word, right? We use it, right? Yeah. I was surprised to find it not in the dictionary. Like utopia is in there, but dystopia isn't. Like, I don't know. Maybe they're going to add that soon.
It's a marketing word, I guess. But it depends on what topia means. Utopia means no place, right? If it means the ideal place, then dystopia is its opposite. But if its real meaning, I think, is no place, like this place never existed. Therefore, it doesn't really have an opposite other than that, exists.
That makes sense.
Our topos is a dystopia, I guess. The place that we are in is a real place, and it ain't ideal, that's for sure.
That's interesting. I now I know why dystopia isn't technically a word, because it's not the opposite of nothing. So the people who actually know about the origins of the word utopia have probably been like, no, you can't use that. That's wrong. But
Well, we overcome that. Usage always overcomes what should be. What is always overcomes what should be. So the dystopia of our language will certainly overcome any utopian dictionary definitions, and we'll get in there.
Yes. And one of the things that struck me that as a fan of dystopia writing and movies is the real thing. The actual pandemic that we've been experiencing has been so much more sort of exciting and horrible and bizarre than anything I've ever personally actually come across in terms of anybody trying to imagine this particular sort of thing happening to society at around this time in history. Like, it's just the real thing has been I guess as it would be, so much more three-dimensional. But when you're imagining the future, do you take how the present is and just try to imagine, like, okay, what could go wrong with this? As is that sort of the process?
And yeah, I think so. I've kind of faced that a lot with the current book, where people say, well, do you really think things are going to turn out this way? And I can only really say is, well, this is the way they are now, actually. So I am imagining the way we are now in much broader terms. It's an imaginative world, but and then some of it is by logical extension, saying, well, we have global warming. So what would happen if the worst predictions about global warming come true? But that's always, that's the context of the books. And I think it's very important. The social relations in the books are also supposed to be revealing of what I think is going on now. There's, I think, like, for me, dystopian fiction is always in dialogue with the present. And I've often in the past thought that science fiction is our mythology. Just, science is our religion, maybe. I mean, we accept science the way people used to accept religion. But it is, mythology is a way of examining the archetypal conditions of life. And we don't really believe in myths anymore, but we have the future. So that is our great unwritten text. And we project onto that our fears, our desires, what could be. And dystopian sees that things are going to go quite badly. That said, I like to think, one of the things I like about Philip K. Dick is it's really exciting to imagine a future, say, of zombies where they're all eating each other and a scrappy band of 12 humans goes and creates their own little society, etc., where it's like the Bob Dylan song, about the end of the world, where the psychiatrist said, well, I've been having that same dream. I don't remember you there. It's like we always imagine ourselves as the survivor of the zombie apocalypse, which is a great situation to be in, I mean, but what if the future is just shitty? What if it's not dramatically, bands of roving zombies eating each other? What if it's like, well, the bathrooms don't work as well as they do now, and we don't have any gas for the cars, so people are riding around on horses maybe, and some of them have, biofuels, and we have solar cars that go 40 miles. You just start imagining all kinds of things where maybe the pace of change slows. We've lived through 300-400 years of rapid change. Well, if the next 300 or 400 years are like, I don't know, the year 700 to the year 1000, where it's like watching paint dry. Pretty much not much happens at all, except it get a little worse. The Romans aren't around anymore. Okay.
Maybe those were pretty good years because they didn't go down in history. The peasants were just enjoying themselves without getting too screwed over. And so we didn't hear about the wars because they didn't have so many. I mean, I like to imagine it might have been
certainly possible. The collapse could be a little better. And then there's always the needs of entertainment. You want to keep people reading. So the novel is a mix of things, and always, and so the same is true of the dystopian novel. There's prediction about the future, but then also once you have your premise down, then you're exploring a premise logically through fiction. Essentially, there's characters and plot and your story, and you have to make things happen.
Right.
And so a lot flows from that.
And telling a story, I mean, this is it's sort of, I already know the answer, but I mean, for me, at least, telling a story is such a powerful way to communicate all sorts of ideas without turning people off and to the ideas you're talking about, right? I mean, when did you come? I mean, but the particular form of storytelling of the novel, the long form storytelling, how did you decide that you wanted to go there? I mean, you were really influenced by James Joyce as a young person.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that I started out as a poet, and I used to try to write short stories, but for as long as I could remember, I sort of had ideas for novels, but I really didn't know where to go with it. And I think when I was younger, I was absolutely influenced by Joyce and the modernists, and I liked reading very difficult writing, and I enjoyed it, but I think there was a certain amount of ego involved. Oh, I can learn to understand this, or this is hard to understand. And I've always loved reading fiction, but I discovered this happened at a very specific time. Before I wrote Specimen Tank, I had this short story I had written that it was based on that was really sort of just a noir, pornographic, weird crime thing about this guy Wally. And so I had that story, but I had traveled to New Zealand, and I was determined to write my literary novel. I was going to write this literary Joycean novel, and it was very pretentious, and I had started it. And a friend sent me a book in the mail, and it was Charles Willeford's Pickup. I don't know if you know Willeford, but he's really one of the great pulp writers from the 40s to the 80s. And this thing was a Black Lizard Press book. It was 120 pages, and it has a trick ending. And I read that, and I was like, that's about the most perfect book I've ever read. And so I said, this is stupid. I'm not going to write a literary novel. And I picked up that short story and I had a sentence in a journal somewhere that said, what if two sort of performance artists, sex worker punks in New York decide to test experimental drugs and found themselves in a hell? So I just wrote that story. And, it wrote itself pretty quickly. It was hard because that was my first book. So and I realized, I may love Thomas Mann, I may love James Joyce, I may love classical literature, but that doesn't mean it was what I was meant to write. And I found over the years that the more I stuck to genres, crime genre and noir science fiction, the more my imagination was engaged and the less kind of pretentious I was. And I did spend 11 years on and off writing a literary novel about New York in the 80s. But in the end, I had the same problems with it. I might go back to it one day, but I found I was much better to realize the ideas I had in that book in the future than a realistic look back on the 80s. And of course, the latest book, Isle of Dogs, kind of combines the two because it reads very much like a 19th century social novel with ray guns and slaughter and explicit sex. Explicit sex. It's kind of a weird mashup of the two.
Is it the decision or to keep on staying in the same world and writing books that are related to the last book? Is that a conscious decision, or is that? I'm always overwhelmed by the concept of people creating whole new worlds with each new novel. That I think it makes a lot more sense to do what you're doing, but.
Well, and maybe it was a slippery slope. I got a few ideas around 2000 that it was a weird just group of ideas, and it turned out to be bigger than one particular book. So one was just was wanting to do a book about global warming, but also the whole genetic thing came up where I had this idea that it's so ridiculous. I wrote it down. What if the most powerful people in the world were slaves? I just wrote that down. And I started to explore that idea. Well, how would that even be possible? Well, what if they were enslaved to the companies that sold them modified genetic material that their parents, say, purchased? And I used two parts of American law where like Roundup Ready corn is licensed. You cannot, Monsanto owns, or whoever the seed company is, they own the genetic code to that seed. You do not have the right to reproduce it. They own it. You only license it. And the other is intellectual property law. I work for 3M, and I get this idea when I'm home, you could do blah. And you invent it, and 3M says, well, you're working for us. So that idea you had is actually ours. You don't own it. So fast forward, and some billionaire buys a genetic thing that makes you a really great basketball player. Like, you're really tall, your eyes see farther out to the sides than normal people, like Bill Bradley, and you have coordination. And your parents buy you this because they're vain. Like, my kid's going to be in the NBA, even though he could be a Wall Street lawyer tomorrow. Well, he's got to be in the NBA. So you get in the NBA, and then along comes Monozone Corp that sold you the code and said, well, we're taking half of all your earnings as an center in the NBA. Half of your money's coming to us because actually we own your genetic code. You don't own it. And so I thought, well, then what if they rebelled and said, no, we want to own ourselves? And this is, labor. What do you mean you own my labor? So these people rebel and they become rulers. And the idea was that capitalism would evolve into an aristocratic form where capital and wealth would become actually, again, the blood. And they would fight to preserve that blood, and to do so, they would clone. All right. So that was one thing. And then I read this thing called the Acid Bath Murders, about a 1920s crime case where these two women ran into this very disreputable guy who was a real estate dealer and a lawyer and stuff. And he basically cons them. He falls in love with the younger sister who's not interested in him. So he seduces the older sister, and he pretends he's rich, and they believe him. And then one day he says, hey guys, we're out of money. Go to work. And so they marry a tubercular sailor, take out a life insurance policy on him, and collect when he dies. And they go on to do this a few more times and end up dissolving people in acid whom they kill. So I thought, all right. And then one day I just thought, what if I set that story in that world of genetic mutants? And then I was off to the races. I had a first line. She was 17 and all leg. And I wrote Gaha, Babes of the Abyss, about those three. Only the year is 2580, not 1920. And they're in the world of rulers. And then one thing led to another. And earlier I wrote a very long book called The Man Who Can't Die. And I already had the idea for the global warming world and the genetic mutant world. So I developed those ideas. It was written it takes place in 2180. So that's sort of, but I didn't know when I wrote Man Who Can't Die that there would be a series. By the time I wrote Gaha, Babes of the Abyss, the next book I wrote, I realized, okay, this is going to be a series because I introduced a protagonist named Thargon in that book. He's not a major character. And then I had my hero for the whole saga. So with the introduction of Sargon, I thought, now I have a hero, and now I can, and I planned pretty consciously the next few volumes.
You did when you were first writing the first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew that would be the beginning of a multi-volume thing, and I actually also knew that I would use a structure where the first book would be the middle of the story, and the next few books would go to the beginning and narrate to the middle, and then the last books would go from the middle to the end. So that's all in place. I've got that figured out, which I think is necessary for a very long work, that you actually have a structure to follow. Otherwise, there would be nothing to hold it together.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like when you actually a relatively simple plot line, it can involve so much detail that it's almost endless where you can go with it. And then if you have a complex plot line, then it's unlimited, basically.
Yeah.
As somebody described you as a poet who happens to write novels, and as a poet who happens to write prose myself, I resonated with that, because when I first started writing articles that got published and that people said, "Oh, you wrote that, that's really good writing," it was the key for me was just that I approached writing prose with the same kind of the same kind of orientation that I approach writing songs with, which is, every word matters, and there's no room for pretentiousness or really long words that people don't know the definition of, and unless you're going to define it for them, so it's like simplicity, clarity of communication, and then it just kind of started, my ability to write things other than songs just kind of opened up, because it was. But I wonder if that's. The poet, how being a poet is informs your novel writing. Poetry came first.
Oh yeah, and absolutely, it informs it in exactly the way you just said. The attention to the word, and as a poet, and I think as a songwriter too, it's actually the attention to the syllable. It is true you're going to mostly be using single syllable words, but making the rhyme and the meter work, you have to pay attention to the weight and sound of each syllable, and then the flow of the line, and then the flow of the line across the stanza. So it forces you to pay attention to the formal qualities of language. The meaning is important, but you're also paying very close attention to all the other qualities that convey the meaning. And so that was really, really important. The problem with novelists, poet novelists, is often that they then go on to write novels as if they were really long poems, and they are frustrated by story, and the sounds of words bewitch them. So, some of my favorite novelists have been poets. But there's the opposite problem too. The person who's going to go and write lyric or poetry, who's essentially a prose writer, and sometimes they end up having a tin ear. There's no, they are not used to paying attention to the minutiae of language. But it can work out well the other way too, because it can just have a more prose-like flow, and the clarity you're talking about becomes really important. And obviously, prose aiming for clarity in poetry or prose is really important. Although that said, the meaning in a poem is not always evident. You're actually subordinating that meaning to the effects of the poem, to a certain extent. I mean, it's supposed to all add up. But I definitely, I can't even imagine how I would write prose without that influence of poetry. I mean, I value it. And then I find when I go back to poetry, oftentimes I start to tell stories, because the prose has gotten back into, now I'll tell stories.
So there's some good cross-pollination in terms of the different ways of writing. Yeah.
And I'm envious of song. I mean, obviously, every poet and every novelist envies song for its directness and, I don't know, elegance, that simplicity that can convey so much more.
Although with any of these forms of writing, achieving that simple elegance is so kind of, I mean, when you've done it, if you've done it a lot, but otherwise it can be so elusive, right? Because it's so easy to write a bad song.
People are contemptuous of journalism or of pop music. I'm like, you try it.
Yeah, you try it.
It's easy. Oh yeah, 3 chords, 2 chords, and blah 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 blah. All right. Otherwise, everybody on earth be writing a hit song tomorrow, because you can still make money off a hit song. It's like, yeah, there's an art not to be denigrated, I think.
And of course, for that matter, you try making a movie with an iPhone or writing a novel that people don't want to put down. I mean, any of those things are very difficult. Easy to do a bad version of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes people say, "Oh, well, the writer wasn't really aware of what they were writing in a novel." I said, "Really?" Because once you've rewritten the same sentence 10 or 15 times over the course of 5 years, you're pretty goddamn aware of every word in that sentence.
I mean, I imagine that you must have the same problem, only even more so, that a lot of, at least among musicians, once you've recorded an album in a studio, by the time you're done with the process, you're so sick of every song. Is that must be a hard thing. I mean, you must have to put it down for months and then pick it up later, so that that doesn't happen. I imagine that's what I've heard is a sort of standard procedure for novelists. Is that part of your process too?
Yeah, and I think also part of the discipline and training is learning to monitor your own mood and attitude towards your own work. Because just like you have to watch out for ego, which says, I'm great and I love everything I do, and blinds you utterly to the faults and the things you got to fix, the opposite of that is, oh God, do I suck? How did I ever get into this business? Why did I do this? This just is terrible. And then you're totally blind to all the qualities and all the motivations that made you do it to begin with. So I absolutely, when I get done with a piece, I need to put it aside before I come back to it. And I've learned over the years to have some faith in that process, that the world's not going to end. I'm not going to abandon it. I'm not hopelessly deluded. I didn't forget how to write. I haven't lost it all. That when sufficient time has gone by, I'll go back and see what needs to be fixed and what's working, and get into the flow again. But absolutely, that horrible moment when you're publishing, when the publisher says, "Can you read through the proofs and make sure everything is right?" is just, oh
no, somebody else do that.
Don't make me do this again.
Yeah.
There's a sad moment before that too, which I noticed, which is when you're in love with everything, you've edited to the point where it's working, and then it's just, you don't want it to end, right? Or I don't want it to end. I'm like, oh, but this is so good now. Now I know how to write this book. I'm really good, but all that's left is the next book, the one you don't know how to write, the one where there are no words, the one where there's a bunch of ideas, a character, a structure, but the details aren't there. And that's paralyzing. It's like, well, if I could just go back to the full page and never face the empty page, I'm good. I can revise for the rest of my life. But there comes a time when your children grow, and you got to let go. So I find myself with all of those emotions. It's, you're in love with it, you hate it, you have to leave it, you have to come back to it. It's unrecognizable. It's like part of your body. And ultimately, it's just like I don't know, the past, and you get on the next thing. It's kind of where I am now, in the middle of the next book, on pause. COVID has made it impossible. I don't know about you, but focusing in the age of COVID, and art is all about focus. It's all about enlarging the focus. More of time, more of space, more of this. What can consciousness occupy in the moment? And between our fearless leader and this virus, sometime in March, it shrank to a little dot.
Yeah.
I
mean, there's something about the you can't just spend all your time alone focusing, right? I mean, as an artist, I always find I have to get out and be interacting with people, and also getting physical exercise and all kinds of other things in order to have like 4 hours of focus in a day. There needs to be a couple hours or an hour at least of walking, and also some time of talking with other people, and otherwise I just can't the focus doesn't remain. So the pandemic is full of contradictions in that way.
There's plenty of time to walk, right? I don't know about where you are, but I've been getting a lot of walking done.
Yeah.
And that's great for thinking. But the social, yes, needing other people and other artists, or even just a coffee shop, all the things we take for granted, I think, curmudgeon or not, guy in the basement, guy on the roof.
Yeah.
Travel. I was in Vietnam on March 10th. I was going to be there 3 weeks. It was a dream trip. I'd always wanted to go. March 10th, I was coming home a week early to the zombie apocalypse. It was, and ever since then, all I've done is planning, how will I get back to Vietnam to finish my trip?
Yeah. I was in Australia. I cut my my trip a week early too. If I hadn't, I'd probably still be there. But I mean, I'd be stuck.
Where were you in Australia? I don't mean to interview you, but I'm just curious.
Oh yeah, I was between Brisbane and Sydney, basically.
Oh, okay, yeah. I went to a beach there and had the best fish and chips I've ever had was in a beach town between Sydney and Brisbane on the coast. Just beautiful country there.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're doing speaking tours, is it I mean, like for me I wonder, as when you're writing novels, if you need that kind of in order to know whether something is working, do you need feedback from people in a live setting like that, or you can probably get it from all kinds of other ways? But is that a really useful kind of immediate kind of thing to get that kind of live feedback when you're reading?
Oh yeah, I mean, nothing compares to standing up in front of a group of people and then having to speak and hear your words hang in the air, especially if they don't know you. And it can be painful, but hearing yourself is really hard. As long as you're in the room, as long as you're in the loop, you haven't really escaped. And you can train yourself, or at least I have trained myself, but there's nothing like those cold, staring faces. And when it doesn't work, oh boy. I mean, the most terrifying art of all is comedy. When I watch comedians, I think, I don't know how you did this, because I grew up with my script, which has been revised and written, and the cold face. We don't get heckled. People are very polite at poetry readings and at readings. But you still know, when those words dropped into a hole and are not echoing back at all. And then you also know, though, when you're hitting, and there's no more exciting thing than when you have an audience and they have you, and, the wall disappears, and it's just the text.
And when you've achieved that, even if they're not like reacting, heckling. I mean, it's clear. You can tell you've created this kind of spell. Yeah,
there's a hush, and you practice. I always practice. Nothing frustrates me more than when I'm in an audience and a performer gets up there who has not practiced, who does not know how long it's going to be, who can't read what they're doing or perform what they're doing. It's terrible. I mean, the audience wants you to be the person, the person who knows. They're there. And they'll cut you slack too, of course, because they identify with you. Thank God I'm not up there. So, it's not like you can't make a mistake.
And they want you to be good, right? They want to be transported somewhere. They didn't just sit down to hear you because they had to or something. Usually,
No, it's not like
yeah,
talking to your mother. Like
yeah,
you love there. You go and you got to be there. No, they want you to entertain them. They have an expectation. Um, so, and if you're really lucky, some of them know your work, so they have another expectation. And then picking, it's really hard to pick material that's of interest too, because in the silent
right.
room while you're reading, you always want to know what's next. But if you've got a 10-minute spot, well, you're going to read 7 pages. So what are the right 7 pages to read?
Mm-hmm.
They may not even be the best 7 pages in the book. They may, you
It has to be 7 pages. It doesn't require a whole lot of introduction for people to follow what's going on in page 400 or something.
exactly, and they're not necessarily going to catch everything. Not that they even would on the page, but you've really got to pick something where the surface is very, very exciting. Or I try to anyway. It's usually violence, like a scene that culminates in violence. You're gonna
Lots of action or lots of dialogue, right? That tends to kind of translate best in that kind of setting.
Yeah, what are the plot is where something happens. So
Yeah.
obviously you got to pick something where something happens. And for me, the short story has always been elusive. The short form. I am much better in a longer form, and yet every chapter functions the way a good short story does. Every chapter really has to have that beginning, middle, and end structure. And yet, it's like killing me to ask me to write a 7-page short story, even though I can write a 7-page chapter like nobody's business. Who knows? It's a mystery why.
And it makes sense. I mean, in for some people, the longer assignments might be the more daunting ones. But I think for a lot of people, the shorter the assignment, the more daunting in some ways.
Yeah. I guess a sonnet is 14 lines, and
right, like haiku. Yeah.
You got to get a lot done there. If you got a whole play, well, like Shakespeare's got a whole play, he can get a lot more done than in 5 sonnets trying to explain the same situation.
Yeah. It's amazing when a haiku works because it works so quickly. Like you 20 seconds go by and it's either working or it's not working, but it works so quickly.
Indeed, it's the moment.
Yeah. Jon, can you imagine where you would be as an artist if not for all the time living in the Lower East Side? I mean, it seems like so much a part of your work and a lot of your writing as well as your life has been centered in New York City, and I know you're not there now, but can you imagine what things might have been like without New York City?
No, not at all. I mean, I wouldn't say that would be for other people, but for me it was not just, all right, I was in my 20s, but it was the most important decade of my life because I really learned my craft and everything was there to do so. I think leaving was also really important. And I probably got all of that I was going to get, but I still love going back and I still get energy going to New York, even though it's not the city that it once was in any sense of the word. But I have relatives there and I have friends there and I know people who are not rich who are hanging on.
Because of rent control?
Indeed, because of rent control. Absolutely. That only because of that, because of rent regulations. And I think if they did anything, just politically, rent control, rent stabilization, free health insurance, free college tuition, these would be the base and a living wage. We wouldn't have to have a communist revolution if we had those things.
Just basic tenets of social democracy.
Yeah. I sometimes feel like we don't have to burn it down. We just have to have programs that we've already had and expand and improve them. And that would go a long way to making life easier and better and having a more just and also more interesting society.
Absolutely. All we want is housing, healthcare. It doesn't seem like that much to ask for.
No, the money's there. So like in New York, I was able to live with my friends and I think the experience of a bohemia that was still connected to the bohemia of the 19th century through a continuous chain of people living and dying and talking in cafes and sharing, it's the breath, the ear, this thing that we share that, and this is maybe what's most challenged by the internet, is the illusion that what we're doing now, which is great in a conversation, can substitute for being 23, walking into a coffee shop, running into somebody and someone else and saying, you know what I just read?
Yeah.
And did you hear who's going out with whom? And like, oh, I can't, that mix of gossip and intellectual life and art is essential, I think. Just as we grow as human beings, the organic growth as human beings, and then having a counterculture and a subculture to belong to was very important.
And the way that was able to happen in New York in a sort of over the course of several generations, and I mean in the Lower East Side, and I mean I know that it's been a lot of change in New York over the course of the 20th century, but there's been this because of rent control and other factors. Before, housing was insanely expensive too, even before rent control. There was this capacity for that kind of community to exist, which now is much less possible in a place like New York.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I've made a sort of study of this, and low life has been a character of cities for a long time, and it created a dangerous space that artists could live on the edge of. And it's been bad because it means obviously that access to heroin and alcohol, all these things is, it's right there. But if you look at the Beats and Andy Warhol, two really important avant-garde countercultural groups that didn't necessarily connect to each other. A little bit, there was some overlap in Manhattan in the 40s and 50s. They were in Times Square. Like they would hang out at coffee shops taking speed and talking all night. When I was a teenager, we used to hang out in Dunkin' Donuts in the suburbs taking speed and talking all night. So there were bars, there were coffee shops, there were sleazy areas where artists didn't need a lot of money, where they could hang out, where they could engage in nefarious activities, perhaps some of them. And it was a very supportive, loving environment in many, many ways. The punk scene was so hostile to the hippie scene, and it was supposed to all be about, hate. But I have never been in a more loving community in many ways. And I know Legs McNeil in Please Kill Me, towards the end, wrote a really astonishing thing, because I kind of, Legs was hanging around, in the 70s down, he was writing about punk in the 70s and was like a punk warrior. But at the end, he said, the whole thing about the punk movement was it picked up where the 60s left off. The 60s became commercialized and were appropriated and became arena rock. And punk said no. And it went back to the roots of the counterculture. It wasn't the commercial hippie culture. It was the counterculture. But that tribal love that people thought they had was definitely there. It may have been us against them, but and it was very accepting of what we would call this,
And to anyone out there who may just think of punk as a form of music, it's so much more than that. It was, and at the time you're describing a whole scene, a whole culture, and a whole attitude, to some extent, like various forms of politics, but in a way inherently political orientation in terms of being against this glitzy glam rock kind of stadium perfection kind of stuff.
Yeah, we refused to live like that. It was a refusal, and and it continues to this day. I mean, the idea that this is all going to be happening, just not necessarily in New York. And if it's happening in New York, it's because 12 people live in a single space. But I don't know. I mean, I think in America we have multiple traditions, and it's that tradition that keeps us honest, that keeps pulling, that gives me some hope that there are, it may be dark, it may see the dark side of capitalism, the dark side of American society, but it has its own, that's its critique, but it does posit an alternative. And
An alternative which really is very reminiscent of the hippies as much as which is a funny thing. This I know, like in big cities like New York and Berlin, there's such a separation between the punk and hippie scenes. It always was, but then when I first went up to the north of Norway, it was so interesting to first be in a community where the punks and hippies all hung out together, because there was only like 10 punks and 10 hippies. So you're not going to just form separate scenes if that's the deal.
Yeah, and these are artificial distinctions in a way,
Yeah.
created by the media, like,
Yep.
But I thought, that just it's this. I don't like the use of the word space. I just think it's overused, but it is the place, the topos, the utopia, where you can be who you want to be without forcing anyone else to be as you are, and without being forced to be as others are. And it's that community of acceptance of those saying, your hair can be long, your hair can be short. It's not about that. It's about your freedom to think, to be, to love, to live. And the idea that we exist to serve, to enrich others, is obviously morally horrific. And yet I think that is what our society basically says, that the individual exists to enrich a small number of other individuals. And somehow we have to fight that tooth and nail. I think we're losing the battle, but what are you going to do? Give up?
Right. Yeah, that's not really an option. I mean, you're going to die anyway. So,
Yeah, exactly. And also we form our smaller societies within the bigger one. We still do that. It's always what we've had to do. And so it continues.
Jon, have many other artists or other folks that had to leave New York or got priced out of New York go up to Ithaca? Where you're around Ithaca now, I think, or did they just go all over the place? I mean, does it? What's that?
Sadly, no. I mean, when I moved here, I had 2 kids. I was in my 20s. I felt like we were very much alone here. There had been a lot of people who moved up in the 70s. Now there are a lot of refugees from the expensive cities, but sadly, so many of them are people who've cashed in. They sell their apartment in Brooklyn, and then they come up here and they can buy a house and put enough money in the bank to send their kids to college. And now those of us who've lived here for a long time can no longer afford to live here. I'm lucky. I actually bought a house in 1994, and so I got in the real estate market pretty early, and it was cheap.
Good move.
So I can stay in it, but I'm privileged for all kinds of reasons, obviously.
Right. Being in the right place at the right time, being able to buy a house, I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? But
yeah. And just, even being in a situation with my job and all the rest of it. But I don't, I mean, most of my friends from New York have ended up moving to other cities. And even the ones that went to San Francisco moved north of San Francisco.
Yeah. Oh, they sure had to leave San Francisco.
Yeah. I mean,
they couldn't afford New York. They can't afford San Francisco.
They couldn't stay in San Francisco.
No.
It's worse than Manhattan. Los Angeles was pretty good till a few years ago. I knew people were hanging on there. But I'm afraid,
I don't know where this hour went, but can you just briefly, on your website, which is incidentally, people can see scrolling down there on the bottom there, but lastbender.com. One of the things, one of the menu items is the Vietnam project. And can you just tell us what's that and what were you doing in Vietnam before we go?
Oh boy. Okay. So the Vietnam project was something I conceived of a long time ago, and I kind of abandoned it, though I've picked it up recently. The fact is, I've been interested in Vietnam my whole life. The war, especially, I did not have to fight in the war. But when I moved to Ithaca and I started working at Cornell, I worked in the library system, and I was in the Southeast Asia collection, which had one of the largest collections of books on and by and about Vietnam in the world. So I just started reading like crazy, as I do. And I thought of, I had a novel that I wanted to write, and I wanted to collect as much material on the history of Vietnam as possible, and especially on the pre-colonial history of Vietnam, because I felt that all we really knew about Vietnam was a war, the war of communism, the war against America, and it was this tragic place that had been fighting, was a victim of wars and colonialism. But if you read Vietnamese history, it's not really so. Sure, they were often fighting the Chinese, but they were also invading neighboring countries, and they were a player. And they also invaded half of their country. Vietnam was confined to the north until the early 18th century, when they had expanded all the way down to Saigon in south. So all of that territory where we fought in South Vietnam until the early 18th century was actually part of Cambodia. It was Khmer. And there was another kingdom in between called Champa. So I got really interested in this stuff, and I started the Vietnam Project. I had an opportunity in March. I was in a funk, actually. I just didn't know what to do with myself. I just retired and just really feeling shitty. I'm 60. So my wife said to me in the course of an argument, I said, well, the airfares are cheap to Vietnam right now. She said, well, why don't you just go? I'm like, what? She said, you're going to be 60. Just go. You've wanted to go your whole life. And basically, I think it was like, get out of here and take your shitty attitude and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
I said, okay, thank you. You love me. I love you. And that was a very loving thing to say. And I booked my flight on January 1st. On January 2nd, the first case of COVID was reported out of Wuhan. And by January 7th, I think NPR maybe had run the first piece on it in the New York Times. And I was like, this could be very bad. And at that point, I started monitoring it. But I still went, and I didn't go very many places. I ended up in Saigon and then one place in the Delta. But I actually met Vietnamese people and talked to them in a way I would not have, because everyone was leaving the country. It was sort of like, I joked, it was like Casablanca, and we were all waiting for our letters of transit.
Yeah.
All these travelers stuck in this hotel trying to figure out how are they going to go home early. This probably happened to you, changing a plane reservation and getting home to the United States of America on March 20th was not easy. And it's one of those moments when I was overseas where I realized I may not think of myself as an American, but in the end, I am an American. And the only country where I actually have any rights is my own country. When I'm in Vietnam, I'm a guest. And we were unwanted guests in the age of COVID, because despite what everyone here thought, it was Europeans who brought COVID to Vietnam at that moment. So we were the disease vectors. We were the other. People looked at us like we were like they were afraid of us, and we had to get out, and people were very polite, and I actually was able to talk to people in a way I wouldn't have normally been able to there. So it was really a great trip, and I actually wrote a 200-page book about it that I am going to abandon at the moment because it doesn't feel right. We'll see what happens, but it was my Vietnam project. Ended up being something I wrote in the age of COVID about trying to travel during a pandemic. And it's closest to memoir I've ever come. So who knows? The Vietnam project yet lives, I suppose, in some way. And I dearly would like people to know more about Vietnam, because I think if you spend 10, 20, 30 years, as we did, financing and then actually financing a war and then waging a war in which millions of people died for no reason at all, that we should know more about this place, that we ought to actually understand it from its own point of view.
Yeah, excellent. Well, there's actually a whole lot of other things I wanted to talk about, but this is generally how it goes with a 1-hour conversation, I find. It's good. It's how it is.
It's been great for me. I mean, it's really, I would love to continue it another time. So just, anyway, anyway, quite enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yeah, me too, John. Thank you so much. And we'll talk to you again.
Okay. I'm going to leave the studio then.
I will just sort of take you out and close out the show, and then I'll come back and say hi.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for listening to this conversation with Jon Frankel. And check out lastbender.com, and you can order all of his books and read his poetry and a lot more. And I'll be back on Friday with a special guest. And I'll be doing a concert right here on these platforms on the last Saturday of every month, including this month on the 28th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And I will just sign off for now. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors and don't pay the rent. Bye for now.